Hi, my name is Gray. I'm an income property investor, and this is the final video walking through a remodel I did on a 2-bedroom unit in an apartment building, a small commercial multifamily building. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I recorded this before, but it was over 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and step it up a little bit. I'm going to walk through the different methods I use to understand the value I created by doing this remodel. So I'm not buying or selling a property, but I've done a remodel. And I'm going to use the GRM, the gross rent multiplier. You may have heard of it. I'll also do independently the cap rate, which is a different method that includes expenses to calculate out a return of a property. I'll look at the costs of the remodel and overall the cash on cash return I did received, and then the most important item, which was to me, was I was able to rent it and rent it pretty quickly. So let's get into it. The GRM, which is more of a kind of a loose metric, it's a back of the napkin if you want to call it that, but essentially you take the property price and you divide it by the gross income. And this is the important part. I use comps, or comparable sales properties, that compare well to this building. So I'm talking, and I'm looking at square foot, the location, the age of the property, and those types of things. And I'll look at what's sold, and then I'm using that GRM that for the different properties, and I'll include that in my calculation. So as an example, if a property sold for $1 million and its general rent for the year was, it collected $100,000, you divide the sale price by the gross rents, and then you're going to get a number, and that's your GRM. And another example, if I had a property that was for sale for 1.4 million, and I know the comps in the area were roughly doing a 10 GRM, then it would have roughly about 140,000 in income for the year. And if it doesn't have that, then that's part of the calculation. But again, I'm not looking to buy a property. I'm looking to understand the value that I just created. So I'm taking the comps that I received by looking at comparable properties, multiple ones, and I got about a 12.8 in my area for the similar size property and the location. For this 2-bedroom, I increased rent with this remodel 16%, and I'm looking at a new rent of $23.20. So I'm going to take the difference between the old rent and this rent, and that's the cash that I'm collecting. I'll multiply that out by 12 months. That gives me $38.40. And now I multiply that $38.40 by 12.8, which is the comp, and that gives me roughly how much value I've added to this property. And again, I'm using the income method. So that's the GRM. The next one we're going to get into is the cap rate. And the difference here is cap rates get into expenses. And when you're looking at it, a cap rate is it's a snapshot of a property over a year, and you are calculating out, you need to know the net operating income, and you take the gross rents minus those expenses, and I'll show those in a second, equals your NOI, and then your NOI divided by the property price will give you a cap rate. And if you know a cap rate, most property listings and comps, they'll share what a cap rate is for commercial multifamily properties. And then you can use that in your calculations. So when I say the NOI has expenses or the cap rate has expenses, I'm talking about you want to include those as part of your expenses, the management fees, the taxes, any repairs for operating expenses, any repairs that you're doing in the year, not fixed expenses like a new roof, insurance, utilities, etc. And you calculate that in. So let's look at this property. I'm looking at the comp cap rates that I pulled from the market, which were 5.25%. And I'm looking at multiple properties. And I'm taking that 320, the added 320 I'm getting in rent in this example, and I multiply it out by 12, and that gives me total income. But I also want to subtract out the expenses. And this property had it has roughly about 28% of expenses, and by passing on some of the expenses to this new tenant, I reduced those expenses 1%. So I'm calculating that in here, and then I take the total NOI for this individual unit, and I'll divide it by those comp cap rates, and that gives me roughly about 53,000. That the value using a cap rate model, and then also had the GRM model that I was looking at. So that's the difference. So GRM, cap rate. Now let's get into the cost of the remodel. The cost of the remodel, we actually took a hit on this. We had never remodeled this unit other than painting, and so we had to replace the knob and tube wiring that was in the unit, and redo a sub panel. Then we had to it had galvanized piping, so we took kind of a hit on this, so the expenses were higher. But I know now that I don't need to touch those, and it'll appreciate the property calculation. But all of those add up, and they're roughly about a 1 year's rent, a little under. And then the cash on cash return is you'll take the amount that you invested, and you'll divide that by the total cost of the remodel. I'm sorry. So it's you'll take the cash, pre-tax cash that you've generated for the year, and you divide that by the cost of the remodel. And this is roughly, I got a strong return, or cash on cash return, which is 13.5%. So let's go back into looking at this. We got the GRM and the cap rate. Roughly, they're telling me about 50,000 that I've added value to this. I've increased the cash flow, and the cash on cash return was pretty strong, 13.5%. But the most important to me is, was I able to rent it? And within 2 weeks, I studied the market. I looked at comparable properties and the demographics of the tenants and their needs and their wants. And then within 2 weeks, in a really sluggish rental market, I was able to get some great tenants to come in and take over the unit. And this is a big challenge right now, because the real estate market shot up crazily, and so did rents during COVID and the pandemic. And then a lot of economic factors have come in to bring that back down, such as the high interest rates. And there's also some other things that are factoring in, and that is people working remotely. They're moving away from my area, or they're working hybrid and they're still moving away. And there's been some layoffs, so it's been kind of a challenge. But that's it. That's my overall for the financials for this individual unit.